Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. So, in this lecture, we're going to look at chapter 23 and see how it is that populations change. Darwin put forward the idea of natural selection, that nature influences who survives and reproduces and who doesn't, but there are other mechanisms that allow populations to change. So, we're going to look at how populations change today. So, first thing I want to do is sort of look at our definition for what evolution is. Evolution is a change in population over time, right? But now, more specifically, we look at evolution as a change in allele frequency in a population over time. So, certain genes are going to become more or less prevalent in the population. And so that's how we can sort of track the changes that occur in populations. That is done through the Hardy-Weinberg equation. We'll have a separate video and different activities for that. So Hardy-Weinberg will be its own thing. But just know that populations change, and they change in the frequency that certain alleles exist or don't exist. Because again, that's what gets passed on from generation to generation, right? Information, DNA. If the allele frequency changes, the population changes. Again, that's sort of how we track this. Now, ways in which populations may evolve or change. One sort of interesting example of this is a cline. So, versions of alleles may change along with geography, or a change in allele frequency can sort of mimic that change that occurs in geography. So, here they have this fish species, and the frequency of a particular version of a gene found in this fish population is altered based on um, the temperature of the surrounding waters. So at higher latitudes, where temperatures are cooler on average, a certain version of the allele is much more common than a version of allele or that allele found at warmer temperatures. And the idea is um, the gene this particular gene codes for a protein that allows the fish to keep swimming quickly and evade predators even under lower temperature conditions. So, a version of the protein that basically allows the protein to work at lower temperatures is much more common at higher latitudes where temperatures are cooler. So that's pretty cool. Didn't mean for that to be a pun. Anyway, natural selection. We know that nature influences what organisms survive and reproduce. But is that the only way populations can change? You know, Darwin pointed out the idea of natural selection. He also talked about artificial selection. But can nature influence things in different ways? All right. So let's look at the ways in which populations evolve. One, of course, is natural selection. Nature influences what organisms survive and don't. And so that over time, the population does become better adaptive. Okay. So it is selective because nature is influencing who survives and who doesn't, and it's adaptive because basically the population is made up of survivors, right? So the population is better suited for that environment over time. Examples with this, I'm sure you all learned about pepper moths like your freshman year of high school. That when the Industrial Revolution came along and soot-covered trees, what was considered adaptive changed. So the frequency of these darker moths became more common in the moth population um, during the Industrial Revolution. Here, looking at the timing for insects breaking their dormancy and flowers blooming is also sort of in flux. Spring is occurring earlier and earlier due to climate change. And so there may be a break in the synchronicity between when flowers bloom and when insects break their dormancy. So that could influence both insect and flower populations because they need one another. Let's see, we've discussed bacterial populations and how they have evolved to resist antibiotics. So here you can see there's variation in the population, right? You have mutations, creates variation. Nature influences who survives and who doesn't, and so the population will change over time. So what that does is it shrinks down variation, but fitness improves. Okay, so here they have these lions. We probably get variation in coat color, but the ones that have coat color that lets them better hide from potential prey are more likely to survive and reproduce. So again, there's variation in populations created by mutation and sexual reproduction, and over time you may lose some of that variation, but the population becomes better adapted and increases its fitness. Let's see. A version of natural selection is predator selection, that prey species will evolve changes or adaptations in order to be able to survive um, potential predators. So here you can see changes that happen in shells. Um, so, snails can better evade the attack of their predators. Let's see. Physiological selection is a common example of natural selection. It's used in the AP exam. Again, we've talked about sickle cell disease and heterozygous advantage. So, in areas of the world where there are higher rates of malaria, you also have higher rates of the sickle cell allele. Even though having sickle cell disease in and of itself, being homozygous recessive in and of itself, lowers an individual's likelihood of surviving and reproducing, being heterozygous makes an organism more likely to resist malarial infection. So the person doesn't have full blown sickle cell disease, but can resist malarial infection. So that maintains that recessive allele in the population when naturally it would be selected against. So as long as you have sort of nature influencing odds of survival, it can maintain recessive alleles. Another interesting feature of natural selection is that it does produce this idea of coevolution, that species either through competition for resources or that predator prey interaction, or even cooperative interactions, can influence one another's survival. So Darwin, when he was on the Galapagos, it's a highly diverse set of islands. He had found an insect that had sort of unique physiological features, and he said there must be sort of a companion plant or flower that sort of matches the features of this insect. So here we can see uh, sort of the physical features of the insect and the flower that um, it will pollinate. So these two species have sort of co-evolved in order to sort of help one another. So that's sort of fascinating impact of natural selection. All right, so here is another way populations can evolve. So, categorize this as a different means of populations changing. It's called genetic drift. And drift is just a chance change in allele frequency. So it's not about being better adapted, it's about being lucky, right? So you can have catastrophic events that severely limit populations. Think of like, uh, you know, severe weather changes like an ice age or like a drought where all organisms are affected. You could think about like volcanic eruption, stuff like that. The right place, right time, right? So the idea behind drift is that it's a chance change in allele frequency, and because of that, the population is going to be different. Right? The population can evolve, but it is not necessarily making the population better adapted. So it's not selective, and it's not adaptive. It's just random. So you can use sort of like the gumball example of this. If you have a gumball machine, and you can have even distribution of these phenotypes throughout the population. If just by chance you remove some of the gumballs, some of the alleles may, or some of the phenotypes may disappear completely from the population, and others become a much higher proportion. And again, it's not necessarily adaptive, so drift isn't great. Okay, now drift also tends to happen in small populations, and that's because if you have a really small population, well, a change in just a few organisms or members of the population can significantly alter the phenotypes of the group. So here, this is an interesting simulation. You can run this and look at variation in populations at different sizes. So here, with a small population size of 20, you can have a lot of disruption in terms of allele frequency. But here, if you move up to a population of 2,000, then frequencies of alleles stabilize quite a bit. Okay, so drift can be substantial if you just have small groups, and that's sort of cool because you think about sort of the history of migration of humans throughout the world. You have humans leaving East Central Africa in successive waves over the course of like 70,000 years. And then you have small groups of people branching out. The Americas, North America, South America, It's populated by a group of probably 10 to 20 people that crossed the land bridge that's now the Bering Strait. So, we've had sort of this migration of peoples out across the world. And again, small groups moving into areas. It's sort of fascinating the changes that can happen. Let's see. Here's again reviewing the idea of drift. When you get these small populations breaking off, it's called the founder effect. So you think of like the Galapagos finches. If the Galapagos finches have ancestor species that were in the mainland of South America, but got somehow moved over to the Galapagos Islands, whether they were blown off course by the winds or storm or whatever the case may be, you can have substantial changes that occur in the population just because who happened to be in the group that survived. So again, we've had migrations of humans out spreading around the world, and again, it can be in small bands of people. So that's sort of fascinating. And on the reverse, rather than the founder effect, where you have a small group branch out, you can also have what are referred to as bottleneck events. You can have some big cataclysmic change, and very few organisms survive. So here, they use the example of the prairie chicken. Now, with the advent of sort of modern agriculture, lands that were inhabited by the prairie chicken have been converted to fields. And what that has done is drastically reduce the size of the prairie chicken in areas like Illinois. So you can see that when the population size diminished, variation declined. And when there's less variation, then the frequency of eggs hatching and producing new chickens was dropped substantially. Okay, so they lost variation. When they lost variation, that made it more difficult for the population to survive, and that creates what's called an extinction vortex. So it's more and more difficult for the organisms to survive when they have small populations and they lose variation. So what they did was, well, they just brought in new chickens. So they brought in chickens from Kansas and Nebraska and had them mate with the Illinois prairie chicken population. And what they found is that variation went up, and then the hatch rate went up as well. So variation is incredibly important to populations. But either by just having your population break off or by having most of the population die out randomly, you can reduce variation. And again, it's not necessarily adaptive. Let's see. So what's the problem with losing that variation? Well, if you lose variation, then if the environment changes, you could be in a whole lot of trouble. The Irish potato famine, I think Ireland has fewer people living in it than in the state of Indiana. And at one point in the 1800s, they had a pathogen come in and destroy the potato crop. Now, because there was very little genetic variation in the potatoes, the pathogen was able to infect and destroy the potato crops, and that killed more than 1 million people. So that's absolutely startling what can happen when we lose variation. So there are efforts underway to produce what we see here as a seed bank. So seeds for the various types of different foods are actually being stored so that if something terrible or drastic happens in the future, there's going to be variation in food available and stored in these seeds. So keeping variation is important for long-term survival. Okay, a third way populations can change is through gene flow. The idea is if organisms move in and out of populations, they take their genes with them, right? So natural selection can influence who survives and reproduces. Random chance or like genetic drift can influence how populations change. Or when organisms move in and out of populations, well, that's going to change allele frequencies in a population as well, right? So the idea of gene flow is that populations can change in their allele frequency by having individuals move in or move out. So again, is it going to be adaptive? Will it be maladaptive? Depends on who moves in, who moves out. Okay, a fourth way populations change is through sexual selection. Organisms usually select their mates, right? It's not a random event. Sometimes with like external fertilization, fish can like release eggs in the environment and sperm in the environment, stuff like that. But oftentimes, organisms choose their mates, and they'll choose their mates based on physical features, right? So it is definitely selective because organisms are choosing their mates, but it usually is for adaptive reasons. So, like a male peacock will have this big, extravagant plumage, making it, more readily or obviously present to predators. But what it can do is try and signal sort of underlying um, genetic endowment that it's like, okay, I've got such good genes that I can support this big, crazy decorative plumage and survive in the presence of predators. Or here, in the case of these frigate birds, what males will do is stand on the ground and inflate this red pouch, it's about the size of a volleyball, and they'll spread their wings and do like this sort of dance to try and attract females and say, hey, look, I can support this big, poofy pouch. Let's see. Again, the idea of having certain traits is that it can uh, try to indicate to other organisms that it's healthy, it's doing well, and it has genes that you would want to combine your genes with. So here in the case of a fiddler crab, a male will have one claw that's like enormous and one little claw. So when he's moving, it looks like he's like playing a fiddle. But anyway, this big claw is meant to try and indicate to a female that it's healthy and that it can support this big, useless, ridiculous claw. Let's see. Here is just another interesting example of sexual selection. So it's the mating call for these particular male frogs. And what they found is that males that have longer calls tend to have faster rates of reproduction and better growth in their livey. LC stands for long call, and SD is like no significant difference. Uh, but the idea is long call frogs tend to have greater reproductive success. So females tend to prefer males that have these longer calls. The downside of that is echolocation, right? If you produce that long call, not only is it easier for female frogs to find you, it's also easier for predators. So, it's the give and take of that. Now, what's the impact of sexual selection? Since organisms, either males or females, tend to choose mates based on particular characteristics, what that does is it leads to sexual dimorphism. Di meaning two, morph meaning form. So it leads to sort of distinct characteristics between females and males. All right, so some reminders to run through. Again, evolution is about populations changing, not individuals changing, because the idea is individuals survive and reproduce or don't. So it's the population that changes over time. And because of natural selection, usually become better adaptive, but because of drift, it may not, right? So it sort of depends on the circumstances. All right, so here we get into some of the different ways in which populations change. One is called directional selection, okay? So the idea is if you have several genes influence a particular characteristic, then usually on average, most individuals are going to be average. Think of like height in humans. Most people are sort of within a certain range, but then you have on the tails people who are extremely tall or extremely short. Okay. So most organisms fall in like sort of a bell shaped curve for many traits. Now, in the case of directional selection, the population shifts in one particular direction or another. So you can use the giraffe example that the population shifted toward having longer and longer necks to reach vegetation higher up in trees when food is scarce. So with directional selection, the population sort of moves in one particular direction. Rather than having a wide variety of characteristics or phenotypes, you move toward having one particular characteristic or phenotype. In the case of stabilizing selection, that tends to favor individuals who are sort of in the median or the average. So Here, in the case of lizards, if you're too little, you're too slow to get away from predators. If you're too big, well, you're too easily spotted by predators. So, Goldilocks example, just right. Or, yeah, three bears, the porridge is just right. Anyway, medium size, body size for the lizards tends to be favored by natural selection in that instance. Or you look at clutch size in birds. If you have too few offspring, then your genes may be underrepresented in the population. If you have too many offspring, too many mouths to feed. So most favor just a certain clutch size. With disruptive selection, what that does is it favors individuals at both extremes. So rather than most individuals being average, the individuals at either extreme are favored in that case. So here, if you're white, a white Himalayan rabbit, you're too easily seen. But if you have a combination on either end of the spectrum, then you're more likely to survive and reproduce. Or again, we look at tail length here. If your tail's real little, it's tougher for predators to have something to get onto or grab onto. But if you have a really long tail, it aids with balance. So it tends to drive populations in one direction or another. Have a really short tail or a really long tail. So here is a way to sort of visualize these graphs. Red, again, is sort of the starting population where most individuals are average. Here, with directional selection, the population moves in one particular direction. With stabilizing selection, the population moves toward the average. And when disruptive selection, it moves in two opposite directions. So directional selection and disruptive selection tend to lead to bigger changes that can cause things like speciation, the development of new species. All right, final ideas here. It's genes that get passed on from one generation to the next. So traits have to be heritable. The genes that code for different traits that can be influenced by evolution, it's morphological. So, physical features, how does it look? It could be physiological. Think of like the example with sickle cell disease. Or it could be behavioral, like when an organism is active day or night. So here we think about sometimes a female praying mantis will eat the male praying mantis after copulation. Well, what's the advantage to the male of getting eaten, right? Well, it's about passing on your genes to the next generation. So if you've mated with the female by allowing her to eat the male, that's providing nutrition that can support the developing eggs in the next generation. So, wild stuff goes on in nature in order to allow populations to change. All right. So evolution, change in the population. It could be because of natural selection, individuals dying or not, reproducing or not because of sort of pressures exerted by nature. It could be due to drift, where just chance changes happen, whether it's a founder effect, the population moving out, or a bottleneck event where you just randomly kill off a lot of organisms. But it's chance. It's not necessarily adaptive. And it definitely decreases variation in the population. And it happens more so in smaller populations. There's gene flow, where organisms move in and out of populations and take their genes with them, so that can alter. And again, not necessarily adaptive. And then there's sexual selection, where you don't have random mating, that organisms actually choose mates for particular reasons. And again, it's sort of oftentimes a matter of trying to indicate sort of underlying genetic fitness. So, regardless of the particular circumstance that you're given on the AP exam, it's about survival and reproduction. So, here we have the dinosaurs dying out. Here's tiny little mammals that will sort of rule the day after the dinosaurs die off and open up some big space. All right, that's all we've got here. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, hope you have a great day.